Well, good afternoon. You came back. You promised you would. I saw your comments on LinkedIn. I saw your comments on Facebook. I even got a couple of emails that said you were looking forward to this episode, and I'm glad that you're here. I'm also glad, at least I think that I'm glad, that this is the first day, first official day of springtime. Springtime is one of my favorite seasons of the year. Hopefully, it's one of yours too. What is your favorite season? Let me know. Hit me up in the chat or hit me up on my email. Well, in any event, we're here at springtime now. I'm going to tell you, here in northern Alabama, it is a windy 44 degrees, and there is also a freeze warning that's in effect. Freeze warning in effect. I guess we can call that the last gasp of winter, trying to get his last gasp out to us, on us, before it goes away until December 20th or 21st. Well, so given the fact that the weather is going to act this way, we are here in North Alabama, and I don't know exactly where you are, but I guess there's only one thing to do is we just need to step back and allow time and circumstances and temperature to elevate us to where we need to be. And that is precisely what we're going to talk about today. Hello, my name is Tim Allston, and I am the host of the 10 Commandments of Leadership. Here we educate, we empower, and we equip those emerging leaders, and you're one of those emerging leaders, and we equip you with God thought leadership, not just thought leadership, but God thought leadership. And also, our aim is always to present current events and newsmakers in the light of best practices from the Bible. And today is no exception. Today is Thursday, March 20th, 2025. And I want to talk about an issue of leadership that we don't often talk about a whole lot. You know, leadership is oftentimes very misunderstood. What will happen is the fact that many people will look at an organization and assume that the top person, that may be the president, the CEO, or in some organizations, the king, that this is the one that really runs the organization or that is in charge. And upon closer observation, we see the fact that really is not the case. In fact, history, literature, and even the Bible show us and tell us otherwise. And that's why my episode this evening is entitled, if I think I've got the title right, Emerging Leaders Move Forward by Stepping Back. Emerging leaders move forward by stepping back. I like to turn to a story, a book that I read some time ago by Herman Hesse called Journey to the East. In this book, Journey to the East, it was a story about a mythical journey that was being handled by a group, and they were led by a person named Leo. Leo appeared to be the servant for this group because Leo did all of the menial tasks. He did all the cooking. He did all of the cleaning. All of those menial tasks that need to be done. Now, his spirit really buoyed up the group, and the group was going along very, very successfully on this journey until all of a sudden Leo vanished from the group. There was no more Leo. And with there being no more Leo to do those menial tasks, but yet important tasks, and give the spirit to the group, the journey was abandoned and the journey failed. Some people look at that story and say that, well, they later learned the fact that Leo was, in fact, the leader. I mean, he did all the things, the inglamorous things that don't get a lot of credit. I mean, he wasn't seeking any praise. He wasn't looking for the limelight. He wasn't looking for the spotlight. But in his absence, they noticed the fact that Leo was in charge of the group. And that very much is the case in terms of us as emerging leaders. The Bible makes a statement in Luke, I think it's Luke 11:11, maybe it's 14:11. It said, "He that exalteth himself shall be humbled. And on the other hand, he that humbleth himself will be exalted." It's a very, very clear-cut example of what we as emerging leaders need to follow in terms of making that come to life. The best example I can think of that is an example that comes out of the National Basketball Association. To the casual observer, they would believe that the starting five, that starting lineup that starts the game, they would believe that those persons, those five, are the stars of the team. But upon closer observation, they will notice the fact that that may not necessarily be the case. At least the NBA doesn't feel it's that way, because the starters don't get any award for being a starter. But interestingly enough, that first person that comes off the bench and into the game for one of those starters, that has become a very heralded, probably one of the most heralded positions on a team. As a matter of fact, that person, that sixth person, is the sixth man. And, well, quite honestly, that position was created and popularized back in the 1950s and 60s with the Boston Celtics and their legendary coach, Red Auerbach. He had such guys as Frank Ramsey or Bill Sharman or even Bob Cousy coming off the bench to spark the team. Now, what that sixth man does is that sixth man, from that vantage point of sitting on the bench, in so many words, stepping back from that starting leadership role, they're able to assess the game situation and to see what's going right, what's going wrong, and where the areas for improvement. So when that person, that sixth player, that sixth man comes in the game, oftentimes he's able to fill in that gap or scratch the team where it itches. Now, this position and this wrinkle in the NBA became so popular that in 1982, the NBA began awarding a Sixth Man of the Year award. Now, perhaps one of the most famous six men, and it was my privilege to watch him play for 6 years at least, was a guy named John Havlicek for the Boston Celtics. John Havlicek was that sixth man off the bench. And as a result, he led the team to winning 8 NBA titles. He was one of those leaders from the bench. Why? Because he stepped back in order to lead his team forward, to the extent that, like I said, in 1982, they created the Sixth Man of the Year award. And then some 40 years later, that award was renamed the John Havlicek Trophy. Now, as I said, for 6 years, as a 12-year-old kid from 1966 to 1972, I had the privilege of watching John Havlicek in many of those games at the Boston Garden. I'm sorry, forgive me, Bostonians, from the Boston Garden. I seem to have lost my Boston accent over the years. And what I loved about John Havlicek is that he was consistent, whether he was on the court or off the court. On the court or off the court. I was one of those Boston Celtic devotees who in my teen years would go to the gardens, to those games, and more specifically, I would wait till after the game and collect autographs. John Havlicek was never too big to give an autograph. And just as case in point, my idol, and to this day is still Bill Russell. Bill Russell was famous for not giving autographs. I mean, I would be there after the game. I would talk with him about this, that, and the other. But whenever I asked the question, may I have an autograph? Young man, you know I don't give autographs. And Bill Russell just famously would not give autographs until I read in Wikipedia one time that years later, when he found out that there was money in autographing not baseball cards, but basketball card trading cards, then he began to find religion, got converted, and began to give autographs. Well, John Havlicek never stopped giving autographs and never stopped making conversation with you. I mean, he was a tremendous athlete. I mean, John Havlicek was so good that he was drafted by not only the Celtics, but also by the Cleveland Browns in the National Football League. Matter of fact, he went to Cleveland Browns camp, and during the training camp, he came in first in their cross-country running, but he chose basketball as his profession, and I'm so glad that he did. John Havlicek what I'm saying, became a model, a poster child for servant leadership. Now, there are examples of servant leadership that have been both good examples and bad examples. And let me point to John Havlicek. I said, first of all, was a model in the 60s and the 70s. But in the 1980s, for example, with the presidency and the White House administration of Ronald Reagan, I think of two examples of servant leadership, one good and one not so good. For those of us who remember back in March of 1981, within that first 100 days of his administration, President Reagan survived an assassination attempt there at the Washington Hilton. And in the flurry of trying to set things straight and trying to get things correct, up stepped to the microphone at the White House press briefing, General Alexander Haig. Now, General Haig had been was Secretary of State in the Reagan administration. He had a distinguished career. At age 27, I believe it was age 27, he became the youngest four-star general in U.S. Army history. He later became the commander-in-chief, number one in the military's European command, commander-in-chief. He had also served as the chief of staff for both in the Nixon and in the Ford, and now again in the Reagan administrations. And because of his track record, and because of the fact that Vice President George H.W. Bush was someplace on a mission in the country and for some reason could not be reached at the time of the assassination attempt while Reagan was being rushed to the hospital. In the flurry, General Haig, in a very sincere manner, stepped to the microphone at the press conference and famously or infamously said, "I'm in charge here. I'm in charge here. I'm in control here. I'll take care of these matters. I'll handle these matters." Someone later pulled him aside and let him know, "No, you're not in charge." After the president becomes incapacitated, then comes the vice president, the Speaker of the House, on and on and on. That label stuck with him for the rest of his life. He never got past that press conference. And in biographies written about him subsequent after his death, all of them, every single one of them makes that reference to Alexander Haig stepping forward and saying, "I'm in charge here." Sincere, but not constitutionally correct. On the other hand, that was an example of poor servant leadership. On the other hand, you had George Bush. George Bush, in many respects, those who are emerging leaders typically have records and have experience and exposures that eclipse or are better than or greater than those of the top leaders. George H.W. Bush was one of them. He had been a successful businessman in Texas. He had been a U.S. congressman. He had been U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He had been the chairman of the Republican National Committee, and he had also been director of the CIA. He had a resume that far, far outshone Ronald Reagan, but Reagan was the charismatic leader. He was the charismatic figure, and therefore he won the hearts of the people. And so Reagan was a smart move. He named George Bush to be his vice president. Now, as a vice president, he took all of the barbs, all of the jokes, all of the punditry that came typically from those late night TV hosts like Johnny Carson. But he survived and he prevailed. And one of the greatest pictures that I can remember was at the 1988 convention, the Republican convention in New Orleans, when opening night, Ronald Reagan, after serving at the end now of his second 4-year term, did his farewell swan song speech that Monday night. On that Tuesday, there's a scene that I'll never forget of Ronald and Nancy Reagan getting on I keep wanting to call it the jetway, on the stairs going up into Air Force One, the presidential plane. And at the bottom of the stairs were George and Barbara Bush waving goodbye to him. There was that image to me, kind of came out of the Bible, of Elijah and Elisha. Remember the story in the Bible, if you may remember it. Elijah was the prophet. Elisha was his understudy, for want of a better term. Elijah, according to Bible narrative, was being translated to heaven. And Elisha was going with him, seeing him off. And Elijah kept saying, "No, you can wait." He said, "No, no." He said, "What do you want from me, Elisha?" He said, "I want a double portion of your spirit," which he gave him. I don't think that conversation ever happened between Reagan and Bush. However, there was a double portion of the spirit that was given to to George Bush. Number one, he became the succeeding president of the United States, and number two, his son George W. Bush became a president of the United States. So there was that double portion. So there was that analogy there. Since we're talking about presidential politics, another example of the stepping back came to me in 2008. In 2008, there were Senators Barack Obama and Joe Biden. Barack Obama was becoming that rising star nationally. He was getting all the attention. He was that first Black presidential candidate to have really gained momentum, even more so than the Reverend Jesse Jackson, I'll talk about in a second. And there was the rest of the field. Now, Joe Biden was in that field. One time before then, he had run for president and had backed out. What people most remember, and this about Joe Biden, was the fact that he made a statement that rubbed a lot of Black people the wrong way. He's talking about Barack Obama, who was clearly the new person on scene. He said he's so articulate and he's so clean cut. Well, a number of Black people really took offense to that. I mean, it was considered to be, what's wrong? We're not articulate as a rule. We're not clean cut. But Barack Obama, I believe, took it the other way. Barack Obama knew what he had, but more importantly, he knew what he did not have. He was viewed, quite understandably, as being very professorial, and he talked in those kind of terms. He had been a constitutional law professor, I believe, at the University of Chicago. He had come out of Harvard Law School. And his language and his cadence and everything delivered that. What he did not have was a lot of experience. He was a first-term U.S. senator. What he did not have is that plain folksiness that people love to relate to. And so, to me, he and his campaign looked at Joe Biden and said, that's really what we need. Biden has the experience in the Senate. He has experience working both sides of the aisles, and he has that folksiness that came out in that expression. That expression that Joe Biden used was, in his judgment, not considered racist. That's the way his mother talked. That's the way she would talk about a person of confidence being so clean cut and articulate. And Barack Obama rightfully read that, made him his vice presidential running mate, and the two of them worked together in 2 terms and successfully. When it came to the time of the end of Barack Obama's second term, 8-year run, it would have been automatic for Biden to be the heir apparent. But the death of his son, Beau Biden, that was the circumstance, allowed him to step back and wait. And then after the first Trump administration and the pandemic that happened that nobody could control, out of those time and circumstances, Biden stepped forward, ran, won, became the president. And that's how that happened. Now, also during that time of the pandemic, there were several incidents, killings that happened across the country of young Black men. There was Ahmaud Arbery, in Atlanta. And then there was the killing, actually we call it the lynching, of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And that stoked the fires of protest around the country, and particularly those, and the lead protest organization was Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. Interestingly enough, Black Lives Matter, viewed as the father of the Black Lives Matter movement, Congressman John Lewis. Let me pause for a second. Let me shift gears a little bit in terms of leading up to John Lewis. Speaking of Barack Obama recently, a few minutes ago. I don't know if you've noticed, but I certainly have, and you probably have, the preponderance, more and more people of color on television, on the news, anchoring, doing special reports. We look at commercials, we see more people of color in them. And while there may be many reasons for assessing it that way and analyzing it that way, there is one undeniable factual piece of evidence, and that is they are the result of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. History will show and the facts will show that out of that movement, although it began as a movement to protest and to fight for the civil rights of African American people, that movement created in the 60s fueled such other movements as the free speech movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, the student rebellions against the Vietnam War, the gay liberation movement, the women's lib movement, and the environmental protection movements. They all grew out of that civil rights movement. The leader of that civil rights movement was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, even though he died, was assassinated in 1968, he left a coattail of emerging leaders behind him. For example, you had Andrew Young, who was one of his lieutenants, one of his second lieutenants, who later became the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and then became the mayor of the city of Atlanta. You had the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who I mentioned, who was a presidential candidate in 1984, 1988, and he was responsible for multiplied millions of people becoming registered voters. But of that whole 65-year history, going back 65 years of civil rights movement, perhaps the most prominent, long-standing second lieutenant who was that emerging leader was Congressman John Lewis. John Lewis, for example, headed up SNCC, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. John Lewis is the one who famously is pictured in recordings as being brutalized, leading the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, on that Montgomery to Selma to Montgomery march. He is also, to show you the prominence of being an emerging leader, we love to talk about, and rightfully so, Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington at the Lincoln Memorial back in 1963. But the person who spoke right before him was John Lewis. John Lewis. And later, John Lewis ran for and became, after that, congressman for the state of Georgia. So what we see, what I like to say, is looking at John Lewis to me very much paralleled what I call the first John with the last John. The first John in the Bible is John the Baptist. The last John is John Lewis. The job of John the Baptist, well, Jesus said it very clearly in Matthew 11:11. I'm paraphrasing, of all men born of woman, there was none greater than John the Baptist. John the Baptist's job was to purely and simply prepare the way for Jesus Christ, to prepare the way for the ministry, the 3-year ministry of Jesus Christ. And it worked. It worked. The ministry of Jesus Christ led to the proliferation, I guess that's the right word to use, of Christianity around the world. Currently those 2.56 billion people are the world's largest religion. It grew from Jesus, and Jesus grew from the alley-oop, for want of a better term, from John the Baptist. Similarly, John Lewis follows in that pattern. Both John the Baptist and John Lewis, first John and last John, they both caused good trouble, which is the phrase that is often associated with John Lewis. They both were very much a part of paving the way for future human rights activism and protest. And they were sterling examples of emerging leaders who stepped back to step forward. And so the contrast that we have with us today is that we, as emerging leaders, need to be prepared to step back, to step forward. And we see it every day in life. When it happens, we need to applaud it. There is a vantage point that those have who are behind the scenes. When they step back, you get a view of this current situation that sometimes you can't necessarily see when you're in the spotlight and when you're in the limelight. To really put a close pin on it, I wrote the statement down here some time ago, is that when you are that second leader, when you are in that position of being an emerging leader, you have a chance to step back. And here in 2025, as emerging leaders, you must balance rapid decision making with strategic retreats to reassess situations that are happening in this volatile, fast-paced world. Sometimes strategic withdrawal or a moment of pause provides clarity for decisive action. And this is being evident right now in the news. Earlier this month, we are witnessing what might be the return of a strategic withdrawal. Earlier this month, former three-time New York Governor Andrew Cuomo announced his candidacy for the mayoral seat of the city of New York. For the mayoral seat of the city of New York. The polls already say that he is the front runner. He's running against the challenger who's the incumbent, Eric Adams. And it's going to be fascinating to watch the potential resurgence of Andrew Cuomo, who, because of allegations against him of sexual misconduct, had to step back, has done some refocusing, and is now coming back and moving forward. What's going to happen with Andrew Cuomo? We won't know. We will wait and see. We will watch and see. As a matter of fact, I'll probably even address this next week in my telecast, perhaps even on the Tim Allston show, but maybe as well as with the Tim Commandments of Leadership. Hey, thanks for joining us this evening. I hope that I've been able to share with you and been able to inspire you in giving you a step-by-step guide with some realistic examples of those who stepped forward after they stepped backwards. If you like what you're hearing, if you've enjoyed what you're hearing, don't just hoard this to yourself, but share it with others. Share it with friends. Like it, share it, and subscribe. And if you want to reach me directly and give me the feedback, because I really want your feedback, it helps me shape shows and shape episodes, then you can reach me at info@timallston.com. Next week, as I said, we're going to touch on the Andrew Cuomo comeback, the comeback kid, maybe comeback kid 2.0. That's not a bad title. And we're going to deal with that third letter of that 11-letter acronym, A Silver Path. Last week, we dealt with A, which is the awareness of being an emerging leader or a silver medal leader. This week, S, we dealt with step back and allow time and circumstances to elevate you. And next week, we'll deal with the I of a silver path. And the I will be identify opportunities where others identify only problems. Identify opportunities where others only identify problems. Again, thanks for being with us. This is the Tim Allston Show. Part of that. Mondays, we do the Tim Allston Show, and that's on Mondays at 6 p.m. on Central Time. And on Thursdays, Central Time, I do the Tim Commandments of Leadership. We enjoy your participation. Let me hear from you. I'm hoping that this will inspire you, will encourage you, will instigate you to become the leader that you know you can be. Once again, leadership is not based upon title or position, but it is based upon influence and relationship. And I leave you finally again with the words of Philip Brooks, an 18th century clergyman and author. He said, "Never seek an easier life. Instead, seek to be a stronger person. Never ask for task equal to your power. Instead, ask for power equal to the task. And then when that work is done, it won't be the miracle. You will be the miracle. Thank you. God bless.